struggling single dad found a bride tied to a tree. What she told him changed everything. She was wearing a wedding dress, torn, dirty, and tied to a tree deep in the woods. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she came from. And when a single father stumbled upon her that morning, neither of them could have imagined how much that moment would change their lives forever. This is not just a story about memory lost, but about love rediscovered, healing in the unlikeliest of places, and how kindness can lead us exactly where we're meant to be. Before we begin, if you love heartfelt stories about second chances, quiet strength, and the miracles hidden in everyday moments, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next inspiring story. Now settle in. Let's begin The Bride with No Memory. The forest was unusually still that morning. Not the kind of stillness that brought peace, but the kind that made Jack Walker pause, his gloved hand tightening around the axe handle. Somewhere between the frost-bitten pines and the hush of snow-packed earth, something felt wrong. He squinted up toward the clearing, where the sunlight filtered through a patch of thinning fog. Just beyond the ridge, not far from where his property ended and the wild really began, he caught the glint of something white. It wasn't snow. It shimmered like satin, unnatural and out of place. Jack set the axe against a log and motioned toward his golden retriever, Scout, who was already sniffing the air with low whimpers. "Stay close," Jack murmured, and started up the incline. The pine needles crunched beneath his boots as he approached, heart beating faster than it had in months. Years, maybe. Ever since Carolyn passed, his life had been one long, quiet effort to keep breathing, for Ellie's sake. This mountain, the cabin, the solitude, they had been his refuge from a world that stopped making sense. But nothing in that refuge prepared him for what he found past the bend. There, tied to the trunk of an old pine, was a woman in a wedding dress. Her arms were bound loosely with what looked like a torn sash from her gown. She was sitting, slumped forward, her body trembling. The white fabric of her dress was smudged with dirt and leaves, and her bare feet were scraped raw from the forest floor. Blonde hair hung in tangled waves around her face, and her skin, pale as snowfall, was flushed with cold. Jack froze. She looked up slowly, eyes blinking against the light, eyes the color of stormy sea glass. "Please," she whispered, her voice thin and hoarse, "don't leave me here." Jack dropped to one knee. "Hey, hey, you're okay now. I'm not going anywhere." He gently reached for the sash and loosened the knots. Her wrists were scraped, but not badly. It looked more like she'd been restrained in panic, not with violence. "What happened?" he asked, scanning the woods for signs of others. "Were you in an accident?" She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Tears welled in her eyes and her lips quivered as if reaching for a memory that refused to surface. I don't know." Jack frowned. "You don't remember what happened?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't even know my name." Silence fell between them, broken only by the wind nudging the treetops. Jack exhaled and took off his flannel jacket, draping it over her shoulders. She flinched slightly at the contact but didn't pull away. "My name's Jack," he said softly. "Jack Walker. I live down that trail just a few minutes from here. I'm going to take you home, okay? You're safe now." She didn't answer, but her hands clutched the jacket like it was a lifeline. Scout patted over and sniffed her foot gently, letting out a soft whine. The woman looked down, then reached out and placed a trembling hand on the dog's head. That small act, fragile, instinctive, made something tighten in Jack's chest. He didn't know who she was or what dark story had led her here in a wedding dress, alone in the woods. But he knew fear when he saw it. He knew broken people, because he was one. Jack helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, her weight sagging against his arm, but she managed to walk beside him. The trail back to the cabin was quiet. The pines seemed to lean in protectively, like sentinels watching a wounded soul return to sanctuary. Jack didn't ask more questions. He sensed she was barely holding herself together. As they approached the clearing, Ellie came bounding from the porch in her snow boots and yellow parka. "Daddy! Scout's been gone for—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes wide as she took in the woman beside him. Jack knelt beside his daughter. "Ellie, sweetheart, this is a friend. She's had a hard morning and needs our help. Can we make her some tea?" Ellie looked from the woman's torn dress to Jack, then back again. Without a word, she turned and ran inside. Jack helped the woman onto the porch swing. She sat stiffly, like her body was unsure of its own movements. The sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. He brought out a blanket and tucked it around her legs, then offered a mug of hot tea. "Thank you," she whispered, staring into the steam. I I don't know what to do." "You don't have to figure it all out right now," Jack replied gently. "You're safe. That's what matters." She looked up at him, eyes shining with fear and gratitude. "What if I never remember?" Jack leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "Then we start from here, one moment at a time." The woman blinked, then nodded faintly. For the first time since he found her, something in her expression shifted, barely visible, like sunlight breaking through fog. Hope. And for Jack, who had stopped believing in second chances, that fragile flicker stirred something long buried. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new story for them both. The woman sat curled on the worn-out couch, Jack's flannel shirt still draped over her shoulders, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of now lukewarm tea. Ellie had placed her favorite blanket, a faded pink one with cartoon owls, over the woman's knees without saying a word, then disappeared into her room. Jack stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, watching the stranger's gaze drift across the room like someone trying to read a story in a language she had forgotten. Her eyes paused on the framed photo above the mantel, Caroline and Ellie laughing under a canopy of autumn leaves. Then she looked down again, as if afraid to linger too long in someone else's memories. "I should call someone," Jack said softly. "A doctor, maybe, the sheriff." She shook her head slowly but firmly. "No police." He raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" I don't know, I just—" Her voice trailed off. She stared at the steam curling from her mug. "It scares me. Everything scares me right now." Jack studied her for a long moment. There was no defiance in her voice, only quiet panic, like a bird unsure if the hand reaching out will help or harm. "All right," he said. "No police. But if you're hurt, you need to be seen." "I'm not hurt, just cold and tired." She sounded like a child trying to stay brave. He nodded slowly. "Okay, then you can rest. Stay here as long as you need." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, uncertain but grateful. "Thank you." He cleared his throat. "Do you remember anything? A name, maybe? A place?" She shook her head again. "It's just fog, like trying to hold on to smoke. I keep thinking something will click, but nothing does." Jack rubbed his hands together, not from cold, but from habit. "Then I suppose we need to call you something." She gave a breathless, almost apologetic smile. "I guess so. How about Grace?" he offered after a pause. "Seems fitting." Her lips twitched. "Grace, I like that." He smiled slightly. "All right, Grace. I'll make up the guest room. You should get some sleep." As Jack disappeared down the hallway, Grace leaned back into the couch. The name lingered on her tongue like a memory she didn't own. Grace, a soft, forgiving word. Maybe it was her name. Maybe not. But it felt safe enough for now. The guest room hadn't been used in over a year, not since Caroline's sister visited to help Jack through the worst of it. He dusted off the nightstand, shook out clean sheets, and opened the window just enough to let in a bit of the mountain air. "Room's ready," he said when he returned. Grace tried to stand but winced as she put weight on her bare feet. Jack was at her side in an instant. "Here." He offered his arm. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were ice cold. Jack led her down the short hallway, flicked on the lamp, and helped her sit on the edge of the bed. "There's a clean towel and some clothes in the dresser. Probably too big, but they're warm." She nodded, blinking hard. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did," he said simply. And with that, he turned and closed the door behind him. That night, the cabin was unusually quiet. Ellie had gone to bed early without her usual string of bedtime questions. Jack figured her mind was working overtime, trying to process what she'd seen. A woman in a wedding dress appearing from the woods like something out of a storybook. He stood in the kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee, staring out the frosted window at the pines swaying in the wind. Who was she? What had she run from? And why did the idea of the sheriff scare her so much? Scout patted over, leaning against Jack's leg. "I know, boy," Jack murmured. Something's not right, but I believe her. Scout gave a quiet huff and returned to his spot by the fireplace. Jack looked up at the old wooden crossbeam above the mantel. When they'd first moved here, Caroline had carved their initials into it. He'd thought about sanding it away more than once, but something always stopped him. Maybe some memories didn't need forgetting. The next morning, Jack awoke to the sound of quiet voices. He stepped into the hallway and paused just outside the kitchen. Grace was sitting at the table, hair still damp from a shower, wearing one of Jack's flannel shirts and a pair of sweatpants rolled twice at the ankles. Ellie was perched across from her, holding a brush in one hand and a stuffed bunny in the other. "I like your hair," Ellie said softly. Grace smiled. "Thank you. Yours is beautiful too. Can I braid it?" Grace looked at Jack in the doorway, eyes full of hesitant warmth. "If it's okay with your dad," Jack nodded. "Go ahead." He watched as Ellie began carefully dividing Grace's long blonde hair into sections, her tiny fingers surprisingly gentle. "You're good at that," Grace said. "I do it for Mommy's picture," Ellie replied, pointing to the frame on the wall. "She had hair like yours, pretty and long." Grace's smile faded, replaced by something softer, an ache that didn't belong to her, but felt familiar nonetheless. She reached up and touched Ellie's hand. "I bet she was wonderful." "She was," Jack said, his voice quiet. Grace looked at him. Their eyes met, and for a long moment they simply saw each other, not as strangers or caretakers, but as people carrying invisible wounds. And somehow in that stillness, a kind of peace began to settle. Not certainty, not memory, but a beginning. Grace wandered through the small cabin like someone exploring a painting she'd seen once in a dream. Every creak of the wooden floor, every aroma from the kitchen, every sound of birdsong outside the window, it all felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. She stood by the bookshelves in the living room, trailing her fingers over the spines of worn paperbacks. Westerns, poetry, dog-eared cookbooks, a dusty volume of Emily Dickinson. The titles didn't stir anything in her memory, but something about the texture, the quiet order of them, felt right. "I've read most of those at least twice," Jack said behind her, setting a mug of coffee on the table. "Used to have more time for books. These days, I just fall asleep trying." Grace smiled faintly. "They look well loved." "Like everything else in this house," he said, then paused. "Including the people." She turned toward him, his words lingering in the space between them. Jack cleared his throat and motioned toward the hallway. "I've got a few chores to finish outside. Ellie's upstairs working on a puzzle. If you're feeling up for it, you're welcome to join her. Or just rest, whatever you need." Grace nodded. "Thank you, Jack. Truly." He offered a small smile and disappeared through the front door, Scout close behind. Grace stood for a long moment, listening to the fading sound of boots on snow-packed wood. Then she looked around the room again, at the family photos on the wall, the blanket draped over the couch, the vase of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. Who had she been before all this? Was her life filled with such warmth, or had it been something entirely different? Upstairs, Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by puzzle pieces and two open sketchbooks. She looked up and grinned as Grace entered. "Want to help?" she asked, patting the space beside her. Grace knelt down with care and looked over the half-finished puzzle. "What are we making?" "It's a horse barn," Ellie said proudly. "Daddy said I can take lessons next summer if we save up enough." Grace picked up a piece and turned it in her fingers. "You like horses?" "I love them," Ellie said. "They're strong but gentle, like Mama used to be." Grace's hand stilled on the puzzle piece. "Did you know her well?" Ellie asked suddenly. Grace looked at the little girl's wide eyes in honest curiosity. I didn't," she said carefully. "But I've seen her picture. She looks kind." "She was. She used to sing to me when I had nightmares," Ellie whispered. "She had a voice like warm honey." Grace swallowed, the image somehow piercing. She didn't know if she had ever sung to anyone, or been sung to. Ellie tilted her head. "You have a pretty voice too." Grace blinked. "You've barely heard me speak." "I can tell," Ellie said matter-of-factly, then returned to the puzzle. Later that afternoon, Grace stood in the backyard garden. It was early March and snow still clung to the earth like a final stubborn whisper of winter. but beneath the surface, tiny green shoots were beginning to push their way up. She knelt beside a patch of thawed ground and pressed her palm to the soil. It was cool, damp, waiting. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did. Her hands moved instinctively, brushing away brittle leaves, loosening the dirt, coaxing space for new life. It was muscle memory her mind hadn't approved, but her soul had. Jack returned from stacking firewood and stopped when he saw her crouched in the garden, sleeves rolled up, fingers buried in the soil. "You know what you're doing," he said, not as a question. Grace looked up, surprised. "I think so. I don't know how, but I think I've done this before." He stepped closer, watching her hands. "You've got good instincts. That patch was my wife's favorite. She used to grow lavender here." Grace's hands froze in the dirt. Lavender. The word triggered something. A scent, a sensation, a rush of sunlight through gauzy curtains. For a heartbeat, she was somewhere else. Someone else. She gasped softly, but the image vanished as quickly as it came. "Are you all right?" Jack asked. "I think—" She shook her head. "I think I just remembered something. Not clearly. Just a smell. Flowers, lavender." Jack knelt beside her. "That's something. A piece." Shiver, Grace stared at the soil, her heart racing. "Why would I remember that of all things?" "Maybe it mattered," Jack said gently. "Or maybe it's where your healing starts." They sat in silence, side by side, as the wind whispered through the trees. For a man who usually said little, Jack's quiet presence spoke volumes. Grace felt it in her bones. This place, this man, this child. It was not part of her past, but it was somehow beginning to feel like home. That night, Grace stood at the sink washing dishes while Jack dried. Ellie had gone to bed early, worn out from an afternoon spent playing with Scout and teaching Grace how to make snow angels. "Do you ever get tired?" Grace asked, glancing at Jack. He smirked. "Of dishes or life in general?" "Either." Jack leaned against the counter. "Both, some days. But you keep going, because someone needs you to." Grace nodded slowly. "I think I'd like to keep going, even if I never remember who I was." Jack turned to face her, arms folded. "That's your choice, Grace. Whether you remember or not, you're still here, and you matter." She looked down, her eyes stinging unexpectedly. "Jack? Yeah? If I wasn't whoever I was before, do you think it's possible to become someone better?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed her a towel, their fingers brushing briefly. "I think," he said softly, "you already are." Jack hadn't touched Caroline's journal in over a year. It sat where she left it, on the second shelf of the built-in hutch beside the fireplace, tucked between an old hymnal and a local birdwatching guide. Dust had gathered on the spine, and though he walked by it nearly every day, his fingers always hesitated to reach for it. Until now. Grace had gone to bed early that night, complaining of a mild headache. Jack suspected it was more emotional than physical, another ripple in the storm of her recovery. Ellie had fallen asleep reading beside Scout, the dog's head resting on her feet like a pillow. The house was still, steeped in the silence unique to mountain winters. Jack poured himself a cup of tea, not bothering with sugar or cream, and stood in front of the shelf. He ran a hand along the faded leather of the journal's cover. Then, with a steady breath, he slid it free and sat down by the fire. The pages crackled softly as he opened it. Caroline's handwriting flowed in smooth, unhurried loops. She'd written in the evenings after Ellie had gone to bed, when the house was dark and her thoughts could stretch out without interruption. Jack flipped to a random page. March 8th. The wind rattled the windows again tonight. Jack says it'll snow by morning. Ellie tried to say lavender today. She ended up calling it lavender. I laughed until I cried. God, I hope she always says it that way. I never want to forget this day. Jack smiled faintly, then closed the journal. It hurt, but it also soothed something deeper, like pressure being slowly released from a wound too long ignored. He wasn't sure why he'd pulled it out now. Maybe because Caroline had always written with such faith in small joys, and maybe because somehow Grace's presence in this house was helping him remember those joys again. The next morning dawned silver and quiet. A thick layer of fog drifted across the pines, turning the forest into a watercolor painting. Grace stood at the window in the kitchen, wrapped in one of Jack's heavy flannel shirts, a mug cradled in both hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jack looked up from the skillet where he was cooking scrambled eggs. "It's like this most of March. Sky doesn't know what it wants to be yet." She smiled. "I think I understand that." Jack glanced at her. She hadn't said much since yesterday's memory flicker in the garden. But he saw the change. The way she carried herself with a little more certainty. The way her eyes stayed open longer when looking out at the world. "You want to come with me into town later?" he asked. "I need to get more feed and a few things for Ellie." She hesitated. "Town might mean people." "It does. And people might mean recognition." He nodded. "Could." Grace bit her lip. "Is it reckless if I want to go anyway?" Jack smiled gently. "No, I think it's brave." They rode into town in Jack's old Chevy pickup, Grace bundled in a wool coat that had belonged to Caroline. It was slightly too big, but she didn't seem to mind. She watched the snowy pines blur into fences, barns, and finally the main street of Cedar Ridge, a small town wrapped in old brick buildings, hand-painted signs, and faded American flags. Jack parked outside the feed store. "You can stay in the truck if you'd rather." "I'll come," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. Inside, the smell of sawdust and hay greeted them. An older man behind the counter waved at Jack. "Morning, Walker." "Morning, Chuck." Chuck's eyes moved to Grace. "Don't believe we've met." Grace's grip tightened slightly on the edge of her coat. Jack stepped in. "This is Grace. She's staying with us a bit." Chuck nodded with the easy indifference of someone who'd seen too much in life to ask for explanations. "Well, any friend of Jack's." Grace offered a polite smile, but her shoulders didn't fully relax until they were back in the truck. "That was harder than I thought," she admitted as they pulled away. "I kept waiting for someone to call my name, or point, or ask why I was in a wedding dress in the woods." "No one's going to do that here," Jack said. "People in Cedar Ridge aren't nosy. They just wait for you to tell your story when you're ready." Grace looked out the window. "What if I never remember enough to tell it?" "Then you write a new one." That evening after dinner, Grace lingered by the bookshelf. Jack glanced up from the dishes. "Looking for something?" She pulled out a book. "Emily Dickinson." He dried his hands. "Caroline loved her poetry. I never quite understood it. Too many riddles." Grace opened the book and began to read aloud, her voice low and deliberate. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul." She paused. "That line, it's familiar." Jack walked over. "Do you think you've read it before?" "Maybe. Or maybe I needed to hear it now so badly it feels like I did." She looked at him then, really looked. For a moment the room fell away, and there was only that stillness, warm, not empty. "I don't know who I was," she said quietly. "But I know this. Being here, in this house, with you and Ellie, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like breathing after holding it too long." Jack swallowed hard. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and closed the book in her hands, his fingers brushing hers. "I'm not asking for anything," she added quickly. "I just needed to say that." Jack nodded. "You're not the only one breathing easier these days." Later, as the fire crackled and Ellie slept upstairs, Jack sat on the porch with a blanket over his legs, staring up at the cloud-smeared stars. Grace stepped outside and joined him, silent for a long while. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you ever wonder what happens after the sky clears?" Jack thought about it. "Yeah, but sometimes it's enough just to sit beneath it and know it will." She leaned back against the wooden post, her shoulder close to his, and together they waited beneath the quiet sky. The snow began to melt in earnest by mid-March. The sun climbed higher, lingering a little longer each day. What had been silent and frozen for weeks started to murmur back to life. The drip of melting ice, the chirp of hidden birds, the faint stir of soil reclaiming breath. Grace felt it too in her bones. The garden behind the cabin had become her sanctuary. What once looked like a patch of brown earth littered with brittle stems and fallen branches now felt like something sacred. She had begun to clear it methodically, kneeling every morning in a pair of borrowed boots and work gloves, coaxing life back into the forgotten beds. Jack watched from the kitchen window, coffee in hand. Grace worked with quiet focus, never asking for help, but never pushing anyone away either. Ellie often wandered out to supervise, offering a running commentary on worms and root shapes. Scout trailed behind them like a faithful assistant. She's really doing it, Jack murmured to himself. He hadn't touched that garden since Caroline died. He'd meant to. Every spring he'd promised he would, but the ache had always been too fresh. Now watching Grace press her hands into the earth with such care, it felt like watching a part of Caroline come back to life, yet entirely new. One afternoon, Grace uncovered something buried beneath the frost-hardened mulch. An old stone marker, weathered and covered in moss. She brushed it off and read the faint letters carved across the surface. Lavender, 2008-2014. Lavender? She asked Jack when he came outside. He chuckled. Our first goat. Caroline named her. Said the name would help with the smell. Grace smiled, but her fingers lingered on the stone. The word pulled at her again, like a thread trailing back into a place just beyond reach. That night she dreamed of sunlight falling across linen curtains, a wooden table set with a single teacup, and rows upon rows of lavender swaying gently in the breeze. In the dream she was humming. When she woke, her cheeks were damp with tears. Over the next few days, Grace threw herself into the garden. She built new rows, spread compost, and carefully transferred tiny starter plants from the windowsill trays Jack helped her set up. The rhythm of it, the slow repetition of nurture, calmed her in ways nothing else could. But one morning, as she leaned over a sprouting tomato plant, a sudden flash jolted her. An image, sharp and disjointed. A white gazebo, strings of fairy lights, dozens of guests clapping. And her, in a wedding dress, standing beside a tall man with dark eyes. She gasped and stumbled back, dirt falling from her gloves. Scout nearby barked once and ran to her side. Jack was out of the woodshed in seconds. Grace? I saw something, she whispered, sitting hard on the ground. A memory. I think it was a wedding. My wedding. Jack crouched beside her, concern etched deep into his face. Did you recognize him? He asked softly. Grace shook her head. No, just a flash. A face I didn't know, but I think I was smiling. It didn't feel wrong. She looked up at Jack, her eyes searching. Why does that make me feel guilty? Jack lowered his gaze. Because this, he gestured to the garden, the cabin, the mountains around them. This feels real now. And maybe it's hard to imagine you belong somewhere else. Grace bit her lip. What if I'm married, Jack? What if someone's out there waiting for me? Jack didn't answer right away. Then he said with quiet resolve, if that's true, we'll help you find them. Her eyes welled up. Even if it means I leave? Even then. That night, Ellie insisted they all have dinner in the backyard, picnic style. Jack built a fire in the stone pit, and Grace brought out sandwiches and a mason jar of sweet tea she'd learned to make from a recipe in Caroline's old notebook. As they sat under the wide-open sky, Ellie handed Grace a crumpled piece of paper. It's for you. Grace unfolded it. Inside was a drawing, a messy but sweet crayon version of Grace standing in the garden. A big yellow sun overhead and purple flowers growing all around her. Ellie had drawn herself and Jack too, smiling in the background. You're part of us now, Ellie said simply. Grace felt her throat close, her hand trembling slightly as she reached to touch the drawing. Thank you, sweetheart. I'll keep this forever. Jack didn't say anything, but the way his eyes rested on her said enough. Later that evening, as the stars emerged and Ellie went inside to change into pajamas, Grace and Jack lingered by the garden gate. The moonlight cast a silvery glow over the rose she had nurtured into green life. Do you ever think about the past? Grace asked. Jack nodded. Every day. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it helps. I guess that's just part of being human. I don't know if I want all of mine back, she admitted. What if it changes everything? Jack turned toward her. Memories don't change who you are. What you choose to do with them. That's what matters. She looked up at him, the night breeze lifting strands of hair from her face. You really believe that? I have to, he said. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here. Grace smiled and something shifted between them. Not a rush, not a declaration, but the quiet blooming of trust, the kind that grows slowly, like roots pushing down through thawed ground. When they finally returned inside, Ellie had already fallen asleep, curled up beside Scout on the couch. Grace covered her with a quilt and gently brushed the hair from her forehead. As she stood, Jack was watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're good with her," he said. "I don't know why," Grace replied softly. "I've never been a mother. At least, I don't think I have." Jack looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to be one to love a child. Sometimes, loving is enough." Grace nodded slowly, and for the first time since waking up in the woods, she realized something profound. Maybe remembering everything wasn't the only way forward. Maybe growing something new could be just as powerful as reclaiming the old. The warm spell continued through the end of March, turning the last patches of snow to mud and bringing out the first signs of life in the valley. Crocuses pushed through the thawed soil, and birds returned to the trees outside the cabin windows with bold, hopeful songs. Grace had started humming again, not consciously, at least not at first, but Jack would catch her now and then as she worked in the garden or washed dishes, her voice soft and melodic, floating like mist through the cabin. It was the kind of humming that came from someone at peace, or at least someone learning how to be. On a Tuesday morning, Jack suggested they take a short trip into town for a doctor's checkup. "Nothing serious," he assured her. "Just want to make sure everything's still steady. It might help, too, talking to someone who's trained to deal with memory issues." Grace hesitated, brushing soil from her fingers. "I trust you, Jack. I'll go." He smiled. "We'll be back before lunch. Ellie's spending the morning with Mrs. Hargrave down the road. She'll make sure she's spoiled." The clinic sat on the edge of town in a small whitewashed building with a green tin roof. Inside, it smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine cleaner, with chairs upholstered in outdated plaid. Dr. Angela Carson, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s, greeted Grace with a calm, unhurried presence. She asked gentle questions about Grace's sleep, diet, emotional state, and dreams, especially the dreams. "Fragments mostly," Grace said, "like pages torn from a book I never finished. Sometimes I see flashes, wedding decorations, faces in the background, a white gazebo, but never names, never whole scenes." Dr. Carson nodded, scribbling notes. "That's not unusual with psychogenic amnesia. Memory loss brought on by trauma tends to protect you from whatever your mind isn't ready to face, but you are remembering something. That means healing is happening." Grace exhaled, the words giving her more comfort than she expected. "Is there anything I should do?" she asked. "Live," Dr. Carson replied simply. "Keep doing what gives you peace. Let memory come when it's ready, or don't chase it at all, if that feels right. You're allowed to be someone new." As they left the clinic, Jack held the door open for her and stepped aside to let a young couple pass by. They exchanged polite nods, but Grace paused at the sidewalk, her eyes drawn to a nearby cafe. A television mounted above the entrance was playing the morning news on low volume. A bright red breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Jack followed her gaze. On the screen was a photo, blown up, slightly pixelated, but unmistakable. It was her, hair perfectly styled. A bridal gown she didn't remember. The same storm-colored eyes. Beneath the image was a headline in bold. "Heiress still missing. Moreau family offers $1 million reward for information." Grace's breath caught. Her hand went to her chest. "That's me." Jack stepped in front of her, gently turning her away from the cafe. "Come on, let's go." She didn't speak during the drive home. Her fingers fidgeted in her lap, eyes glassy as the pines whipped past the window. Jack kept glancing over but said nothing. Back at the cabin, Grace sat on the edge of the porch swing, arms wrapped around her knees. Jack stood nearby, leaning against the railing, hands deep in his coat pockets. "It's real," she said quietly. "I really am someone else. Someone important, apparently." "You've always been someone important," Jack said. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "That wasn't my face on a milk carton. That was national news." "Doesn't change who you are now," he said. "But what if it does?" she whispered, eyes searching his. "What if I'm not the person who belongs here with you and Ellie? What if I was someone unkind, entitled? What if I don't deserve this?" Jack knelt in front of her, his voice calm but firm. "Grace, or Clara, or whoever you were before, you've earned everything here with your heart. You don't need a name to prove that. her eyes filled with tears. But what if I do have people out there, Jack? Family, friends, someone who loves me and is waiting for me to come back. He swallowed hard. Then we'll help you find them. But you'll lose me. Jack didn't look away. If you leave, I'll miss you. That's the truth. But I'd rather lose you knowing you found your truth than keep you here with a lie. Grace let the silence wrap around them, her throat tight, her soul at war with itself. She wasn't ready to remember, but she wasn't ready to forget what she'd found here either. Later that evening, as a cold wind swept through the valley, Grace stood at the window of the guest room, watching the first stars pierce the sky. The news segment had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She didn't know what was worse, being forgotten or being remembered by a world she didn't recognize. A quiet knock came at the door. It was Ellie, barefoot in pajamas, holding a small book under one arm. "Can I sleep in here tonight?" she asked. Grace nodded and opened the covers for her. As Ellie settled beside her, she whispered, "Daddy said you might have to go away." Grace's heart clenched. "I don't know yet, sweetheart." Ellie turned on her side, facing her. "If you do, can you still write to us?" Grace swallowed. "Yes, I promise." "I drew another picture for you," Ellie said sleepily. "It's me, and you, and Daddy planting flowers. And there's a bunny, too." Grace smiled through her tears. "I can't wait to see it." Within minutes, Ellie was asleep, her little hand curled into Grace's. And as the firelight flickered against the walls, Grace lay beside her, eyes wide open, wondering how a woman with no past could ever choose between two futures, one that might belong to her blood and one that had claimed her heart. The next morning brought a pale, undecided sun, hovering just above the trees, as if unsure whether to stay or retreat. Grace stood at the kitchen sink, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching condensation form on the window pane. Behind her, Ellie sat at the small kitchen table, drawing quietly. Jack had already left for the mechanic's shop in town, leaving behind his usual note on the counter. Back before lunch. Wood stacked, coffees fresh, stay warm. Everything looked the same, felt the same, but it wasn't. Grace's reflection in the window wasn't a stranger anymore, yet it wasn't fully her either. There was weight in her bones this morning, an invisible ache where clarity was beginning to take root. The woman on the news had her face, her smile, but her posture had been different, straighter, sharper. There had been something in her eyes that looked confident, unreachable. She turned away from the window and sat across from Ellie. "What are you working on?" Ellie grinned and held up the picture. It was a drawing of a wedding, crayon figures standing under a white gazebo with flowers and birds in the sky. "That's you," Ellie explained, pointing to the bride with a glowing yellow dress. "And that's Daddy, and I'm the flower girl." Grace stared at it, her chest tightened. "You think I'm going to marry your dad?" she asked gently. Ellie shrugged. "I think you make him happy." No. Grace blinked, caught off guard by the innocence and clarity in the child's voice. "He smiles more since you came, and you cook better pancakes," Ellie added thoughtfully. Grace chuckled, the tension in her chest easing for just a moment. "Well, that's high praise." Ellie looked up, suddenly serious. "You're not going away, are you?" "I don't know," Grace admitted softly. "I might have a family somewhere, people who've been looking for me." "But we're your family too," Ellie whispered. Grace reached across the table and took Ellie's small hand. "Yes, you are." That afternoon, when Jack returned, Grace was waiting for him on the porch. Her coat was zipped, her eyes steady. "I want to go back into town," she said. "To the library." Jack studied her for a moment, reading the resolve beneath her calm tone. "Are you sure?" "No, but I need to know more. If that's me, if I'm really Clara Moreau, then I can't pretend it's not true." Jack gave a single nod. "I'll drive." The Cedar Ridge Library was a modest building tucked between the post office and a hardware store. Inside, it smelled of old books, wood polish, and faintly of lavender, though Grace couldn't be sure if that last part was real or imagined. She sat at one of the computers, Jack nearby, quietly pretending to read a farming magazine. He was close enough to offer support, but far enough to let her make the choice. She typed Clara Moreau into the search bar and hit enter. There she was, headline after headline. "Clara Moreau vanishes before wedding to tech heir. Moreau family, we just want her home. $1 million reward offered in disappearance of Boston heiress. Grace clicked through the articles, each one filling in the shape of a life she didn't recognize. Clara Moreau, only daughter of Victor and Evelyn Moreau. Socialite, philanthropist, former equestrian champion, engaged to Evan Chandler, CEO of a fast-growing robotics firm. Wedding date, February 10th. Estimated time of disappearance the evening before. She leaned back in the chair, hands trembling. That was only 6 weeks ago. I ran, she murmured. Jack looked up. I ran from the wedding, she repeated. I don't know why, but I didn't want to marry him. Jack didn't speak. He simply waited, steady and unshaken, like the mountain itself. Grace scrolled down. One article included security footage, grainy but clear. Clara exiting a hotel through the rear lobby, dressed in street clothes holding a duffel bag. Her breath caught. She hadn't been taken. She had left on purpose. Back at the cabin, Grace sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames while Jack poured them each a cup of tea. So, he said quietly, it's real. You know who you are. Grace nodded. I still don't remember any of it, not truly. But I know now. I know I left. I disappeared. Jack sat across from her. Do you think you were running from him? Or something else? She hesitated. Both, maybe. I don't remember being afraid of him, but I don't remember loving him either. It all feels distant. Like someone else's movie I watched too many times. Jack set down his cup. What are you going to do? Grace looked up at him, eyes filled with grief and clarity. I don't know. I feel like I owe them an explanation. My parents, Evan, the people I left behind. But I also feel like the person I became here matters just as much. She paused. I'm not Clara. Not anymore. Not fully. I don't want to go back to that world. Not if it means giving up this one. Jack met her gaze. You don't have to decide today. Grace looked down at her hands. What if I already have? That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She walked out onto the porch, wrapping herself in a quilt, and sat beneath the stars. The sky was clear, endless. She listened to the quiet hum of nature, the gentle rustling of trees, the far-off hoot of an owl. Then she heard the screen door creak. Jack stepped out beside her, holding 2 mugs. Couldn't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. Too much noise in my mind. He sat next to her, handing her one of the mugs. They sipped in silence. Finally, she said, I left everything behind because something inside me knew it wasn't right. But I didn't run to anything. I didn't even know where I was going. Jack turned to her. And now? Grace looked at him, truly looked. His weathered face, his steady presence, the way his eyes held hers without trying to solve or fix. Just be. Now, she whispered, I feel like I've already arrived. Jack didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. The warmth between them filled the space without touch. The truth she couldn't remember had found her, but it no longer frightened her. It was just a page from an old chapter. And this was the beginning of something she could finally write herself. The morning light poured across the cabin floor in long golden slants, as if the sun itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. Grace sat on the porch steps, a basket of newly picked herbs in her lap, her eyes fixed on the tree line where the fog was lifting. Spring had finally settled in the valley, and everything around her seemed to stretch and bloom with cautious joy. But inside her, a quiet war raged. She knew who she was now, knew her name, her family, the headlines that still ran on TV screens far from here. Clara Moreau, runaway bride, missing heiress. It was all true. The facts had caught up to her, but the truth, her truth, felt like something else entirely. Every morning she woke up to Ellie's laughter, Jack's coffee, the smell of damp soil and pine wood smoke. That truth grew louder. I didn't just lose my memory, she whispered to the trees. I found something better. She hadn't told Jack yet, not fully, not what she intended to do. But it was coming. She could feel the moment building, like the pressure before a summer storm. Jack felt it too. He was a man of few words and quieter instincts, but he knew when the winds were changing. He saw it in the way Grace moved through the house, graceful, gentle, but with a subtle distance now, as though part of her had already begun to walk away. He was splitting kindling in the woodshed when he saw the truck. It wasn't from town. Black, polished, with tinted windows. It climbed the dirt road like it didn't belong here, and knew it. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped outside just as the vehicle pulled up to the edge of the drive. The door opened. A tall man in a wool coat and expensive shoes stepped out. His eyes scanned the cabin, the trees, the porch, calculating. "Jack Walker?" the man asked. Jack nodded slowly. "I'm Ethan Vance, private investigator for the Moreau family." He extended a business card. "I believe you've been caring for someone who belongs to them." Jack didn't reach for the card. "She's not an object." Vance didn't blink. "My apologies. I only mean that she's missed. Her parents have been desperate for news. She's safe here. She's also a public figure, Mr. Walker. Her disappearance caused a media storm. If the press finds her here before the family does, things could get complicated." Jack's jaw tightened. "She hasn't asked to be found, but she has been found." Before Jack could answer, the front door creaked open. Grace stepped onto the porch. Vance's expression shifted. He took a step forward. "Clara?" She stopped at the edge of the steps, her back straight, eyes level. "That name doesn't mean what it used to." Vance looked uncertain for the first time. "Your parents—" "I'll speak to them," Grace interrupted, "but on my terms, not theirs, and not yours." Jack watched her, calm, composed, radiant in her clarity. She wasn't the woman he'd found in the forest weeks ago. She was something new, someone whole. "I'll come with you," she said softly, "but I'm not staying." Vance hesitated. "They won't understand." "Maybe not," Grace said, "but I owe them that conversation, and I owe myself the right to leave it behind." That afternoon, Grace packed a small overnight bag, not because she was leaving for good, because she was choosing what to take with her, and what to leave. Ellie sat on her bed, hugging her knees. "Are you coming back?" she asked, her voice small. Grace knelt beside her. "Yes, but I need to go say goodbye to a version of myself I don't want to be anymore." Ellie blinked. "Like a butterfly?" Grace smiled. "Exactly like that." She kissed her forehead and pressed the crayon wedding drawing into Ellie's hands. "Keep this safe for me." Before she climbed into the car with Vance, Grace turned to Jack. He stood by the fence, hands in his pockets, looking at her like he wanted to say 1,000 things and didn't trust any of them to be enough. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me before I even knew who I was." Jack stepped closer. "If you come back, I will. I'll be here," he said quietly, "whether you come back as Clara or Grace or someone else entirely." She touched his cheek, eyes glistening. "I only want to come back as the woman you believed in." Then she turned and got into the car. Jack stood in the dust of the driveway long after the car disappeared into the trees. The Moreau estate was everything she remembered and nothing she recognized. Marble halls, gilded staircases, walls lined with paintings of ancestors whose faces might as well have belonged to strangers. Her mother wept the moment she walked in. Her father clutched her hand like it was a life raft. The reunion was full of cameras, tears, security detail, reporters. It wasn't home. It never had been. Over the next 2 days, Grace sat with them, listened to their stories, their fears, their guilt. She reassured them she was alive, not angry, not broken. She accepted their concern, their offers of therapy, their plans to restore her place in the world. Then gently, she declined them all. "I'm not coming back to this life," she said over breakfast on the veranda. "I've found something that makes me feel more like myself than I ever did here." Her father looked heartbroken. Her mother looked stunned, but neither tried to stop her. And when she walked out the front doors of the estate with her single bag and a heart full of certainty, Clara Moreau finally said goodbye. When Grace stepped out of the cab in front of the cabin 2 days later, the wind smelled of pine and wood smoke. The light slanted through the trees like it had waited just for her. Jack was chopping wood out back. He turned, eyes widening. She smiled. "I told you I'd come back." He didn't say a word. He just walked forward and pulled her into his arms. And for the first time in a long, long time, there was no past chasing her. Only the present and the beautiful unknown that waited just ahead. The day Grace returned to the cabin, the valley seemed to exhale. The trees stood taller, The wind softened. The birds, silent all morning, filled the branches with song again, as if the rhythm of the woods had been waiting for her to resume. She slipped easily back into the life she left only days before, planting, baking, walking alongside Jack and Ellie through the tall grasses. Yet something had changed unmistakably in her. She moved with quiet conviction, as if each step she took was chosen, not wandered into. Jack noticed. He hadn't asked what had happened in Boston. She'd volunteered a few small details: the tense conversation with her parents, the eerie coldness of the estate, the final, hollow meeting with Evan Chandler, her would-be groom, who hadn't even asked if she was all right. He seemed more upset about the wedding venue than about me, she'd said, half laughing, half grieving. But beyond that, she didn't linger. What matters now, she told Jack one evening as they sipped tea by the fire, is that I came back to what felt real. He'd simply nodded, his hand resting lightly on hers. April arrived with unexpected heat. By the second week, the streams were running fast, and the grass grew thick and green underfoot. Grace had begun setting up a small produce stand near the road with Ellie, selling bunches of herbs, early spring greens, and homemade candles poured into mason jars. They called it the garden table, painted in Ellie's looping handwriting. On Friday morning, Jack headed out to the far ridge to help an older neighbor repair a fence line. Grace stayed behind with Ellie, planning to tend the garden and prepare lunch. Around noon, the wind shifted. Grace was in the back rows with Scout when she smelled it, faint at first but distinct. Smoke, not the familiar scent of the fireplace or the wood stove. This was different, sharper, drier, wild. She looked toward the ridge. The sky was starting to tint, barely visible through the tops of the trees. Her heart stuttered. Then a sound echoed through the valley, the distant crackle of burning wood, followed by the keening cry of a hawk wheeling overhead. She ran. "Ellie!" she called, voice sharp. "Get your boots, now!" The girl appeared on the porch, clutching her sketch pad. "What's wrong?" "Into the truck, honey, now. Don't argue." She tossed the garden gloves aside and helped Ellie into the passenger seat, Scout leaping into the back. Grace slammed the door, turned the key. The old truck growled awake. As they turned onto the road, she glanced back. A plume of smoke had begun to rise behind the ridge. It was spreading fast, hungry and uncontained. They passed the neighbor's pasture on the way down, and Grace pulled over, yelling for help. The neighbor, eyes wide, nodded and pointed toward the county road. "We called it in," he shouted. "Fire crews en route. Wind's bad today. Gonna move fast." Grace nodded and drove on, heart thudding. At the edge of the main road, she saw flashing lights approaching. Relief washed over her as she spotted a fire truck, then a familiar shape running toward them. "Jack." She stopped the truck, leapt out. "Jack!" He caught her in a hug so tight it knocked the breath from her lungs. "Are you okay?" "We're fine," she gasped. "Ellie's in the truck. I smelled the smoke." "You did right," he said. "Fast action saved time. They're trying to cut a brake line now." Grace turned toward the ridge. "Will it reach the cabin?" Jack hesitated. "It's possible." She looked back at the truck. "Then we have to go." But Jack stopped her. "I need to stay and help. Go with Ellie. Take her to town. I'll be right behind when I can." Grace's instinct was to argue, but she read the calm in his face, the unshakable steadiness he wore like armor. So she nodded, kissed him once, quick, fierce, and climbed back into the truck. In town, the community center buzzed with energy. Locals gathered to offer aid, check updates, pass out food and water. Grace helped settle Ellie with some volunteers and stood by the radio desk, waiting for word. Hours passed. The fire had been partially contained by nightfall, thanks to a shift in wind and the quick arrival of crews. Several outbuildings on the North Ridge were lost, but no homes yet. When Jack finally appeared at the door, covered in ash, sweat, and soot, Grace exhaled so hard she nearly crumpled. They didn't speak, just held each other for a long, long moment. "I thought I'd lost it," Jack murmured into her hair. "The cabin. Everything." "But you didn't," Grace whispered. "We're still here." The next morning, Grace walked with Ellie back to the garden. There were scorch marks on the far edge of the field, but the cabin had been spared. The plants looked wilted, stunned, but alive. Ellie knelt down, touching a singed basil leaf. Will it grow again? Grace looked around them, at the blackened soil, the patches of green pushing through anyway. Yes, she said. It will. Jack joined them a moment later, limping slightly from a minor sprain, but otherwise intact. He stood beside Grace, their shoulders brushing. I think it's time we rebuild, he said. We didn't lose it, she replied, smiling. We're just starting from stronger roots. That night back in the cabin, the air smelled like smoke and pine sap. Grace tucked Ellie into bed, kissed her forehead, and stepped out onto the porch where Jack was sitting, watching the stars emerge. She sat beside him and reached for his hand. I've been thinking, she said. Uh-oh, she smiled. I want to stay. He turned. I thought you already decided that. I did, she said, but now I want to build something. Not just stay, with you, with Ellie, with this place. Jack's voice was quiet. Then we build. Above them, the stars blinked softly. Behind them, the forest whispered and waited. And around them, something sacred and wild began to grow again. The fire had left a scar, not just on the land, but in the air. In the way the pines whispered a little quieter, and the birds took longer to return to song. Yet even with ash still clinging to the edges of the field, life pushed forward. So did Grace. Over the next week, she doubled down in the garden, turning over burnt soil, planting new seeds, and repairing the hand-painted sign for the garden table with Ellie's help. Jack cleared out the shed, fixing what he could salvage, and replacing what he couldn't. There was a rhythm to their days now, weathered but gentle. Rebuilding was easier than remembering, and more healing too. Then without warning, the world Grace had walked away from found its way back. It came in the form of a black town car, humming up the driveway on a Wednesday morning. Jack stood by the woodpile when he saw it. He didn't need to read the license plate to know. Grace met the car on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her hair tied back with a bandana, soil under her nails. She looked nothing like the woman in the news clippings, and she didn't care. The man who stepped out was tall, lean, and impeccably dressed. His silver hair gleamed in the sun. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that had seen too much, and not nearly enough. Her father. Clara, he said softly. Grace, she corrected, standing her ground. Victor Moreau blinked once. All right, then. Behind him, another door opened, and Evelyn Moreau stepped out, more tentative, her heels sinking slightly in the gravel. We didn't mean to ambush you, she said gently. We asked your assistant, and she told us where to find you. I don't have an assistant, Grace replied. Victor cleared his throat. Your attorney. We've been working with her since the trust accounts needed authorization. You've been removed as primary beneficiary until your return. Grace looked from one to the other. So this isn't just a reunion, it's about money. No, Evelyn said quickly. It's about you, about finding out if you're truly okay. Grace crossed her arms. I'm more than okay, but I'm not going back to that world. Victor's face twitched. Clara, Grace, you don't have to cut us out completely. I'm not cutting you out, she said. I'm choosing a life that feels like mine. For once. Jack approached then, cautious but calm. Would you like some coffee? Victor gave a stiff nod. Evelyn smiled with soft relief. They sat on the porch, mismatched mugs in hand, the Moreaus looking painfully out of place among the rustic charm, like oil paintings hanging in a farmhouse kitchen. Grace stood between them and Jack, her voice even. I'll answer anything, but I need you to hear me first. I'm not the daughter you lost. I'm the woman I became when I stopped trying to be her. Evelyn's eyes filled. Can we get to know this version of you? Grace paused, then, yes, but on equal footing. Later that evening, after the Moreaus had returned to their hotel, Jack and Grace stood by the garden, where new sprouts were pushing their way through blackened soil. I never thought they'd show up here, Jack admitted. I always thought they might, Grace said, but I didn't expect it to hurt so little. Jack looked at her. I still love them, she said, but I don't belong to them. I belong to myself now, and maybe to this place. He moved closer. And to me? She didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand and laced her fingers through his, squeezing tight. The following morning, she met her parents for breakfast in town. They sat in a quiet corner of the diner, sipping weak coffee and eating eggs that came from the farm down the road. Grace talked, really talked, about the fire, about Ellie. about the nights when she'd cried in the dark, not knowing who she was, but feeling more at home than she ever had in Boston. Evelyn wiped tears from her cheek. "I'm so sorry we didn't see how lost you were." "I didn't know either," Grace replied. "But the truth is, I wasn't running from you. I was running from a life that never let me breathe." Victor sat in silence, staring at his hands. Then he said, "You've grown into someone strong, not in the way I expected, but maybe in the way we needed." Grace blinked. He continued, "Your trust is intact. Your name is still yours, but so is your choice. We just wanted you to know, whatever you build out here, we won't try to tear it down." Grace exhaled, not realizing until that moment how tightly she'd been holding her breath. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, Grace walked the trail behind the cabin, stopping at the overlook where the trees opened up to a sweeping view of the valley. The sunset painted everything in gold and rose. Jack joined her, 2 cups of tea in hand. "Your folks heading back tomorrow?" "Yes," Grace said, "but they're not trying to take me with them." Jack smiled softly. "They'd lose that battle anyway." Grace laughed and her eyes glistened. "I made my choice, Jack. For real this time." He didn't ask her to explain. Still, she did. "I want this life. You, Ellie. The dirt under my nails, the firewood stacked by the door. The quiet. The truth. I want us. And I don't want to keep calling it temporary." Jack didn't hesitate. He pulled something from his jacket pocket. A small wooden ring box, scuffed and handmade. He opened it. Inside was a simple silver band with a tiny lavender engraving etched into the metal. Grace gasped. "It's not flashy," he said, "but it's grown from the roots of everything we've been through." She took it in trembling fingers. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Yes." Jack smiled, slipping the ring onto her finger. And beneath the stars, with the scent of damp soil and pine all around them, Grace chose not just the man or the place, but the life they would build together, one day, one season, one sunrise at a time. Spring in the valley arrived like a hymn, quiet at first, almost hesitant, then swelling into a chorus of green and bloom. The snow melt fed the creeks, the sun lingered longer on the mountaintops, and the wildflowers returned to the edges of the garden as if answering a long-awaited call. Grace woke early every morning, often before the birds. She liked the hush of that hour, the space it gave her to breathe, reflect, and smile into the silence. Her ring, now glinting on her left hand, was as modest as it was meaningful. She wore it like skin. Jack had made it himself over weeks, carving and shaping it between long hours at the garage and late evenings by the fire. He never told her how many times he'd restarted it. She never asked. Some things didn't need words. The cabin had changed too. There were fresh curtains in the windows, sewn by Grace and Ellie on rainy afternoons. The porch swing had been sanded and repainted. The kitchen had a new shelf lined with mason jars filled with dried herbs from the garden, lavender, thyme, chamomile. On the sill above the sink, a small sign Ellie had painted read, "Hope grows here," and it did. Everywhere Grace looked, life was rising from the ground. One afternoon, as Grace and Ellie watered the garden, Jack pulled up in the truck, a grin on his face and a stack of mail in hand. "Guess who got official business from Boston?" he called. Grace wiped her hands on her jeans and walked over. Jack handed her a thick envelope with the Moreau family crest stamped in gold. Her expression softened. Inside was a handwritten letter from her mother, not her assistant. Evelyn wrote of spring at the family estate, of the way the wind carried the scent of lilac through the old hallways, and of her own quiet attempts to tend a forgotten rose garden in the back. At the bottom she'd written, "You were always drawn to growing things. Perhaps it was your heart's way of knowing what it needed before the rest of you did." Grace folded the letter slowly. She smiled, not with nostalgia, but peace. The past no longer tugged her backward. It simply waved from the horizon, acknowledged, respected, and released. That weekend, the town hosted its annual spring reopening market, a tradition marking the end of frost and the start of planting season. Grace, Jack, and Ellie loaded the truck with crates of herbs, seedlings, candles, and jars of honey from a neighboring farm. The garden table stand was set up on the corner near the church steps. Ellie handed out hand-drawn signs and Scout dozed under the table like an unofficial mascot. People came steadily throughout the day. Neighbors, friends, even strangers who'd heard about the runaway bride who became a gardener. Grace met them all with kindness, never flinching at the curious glances or gentle questions. By afternoon, they'd nearly sold out. As Grace restocked a row of lavender bunches, she heard a soft voice behind her. "You weren't easy to find." She turned. A young woman stood there, perhaps late 20s, wearing a simple blouse and jeans, her eyes filled with tentative recognition. "I'm sorry." The woman stepped closer. "My name's Leah. I was at your wedding." "Well, your almost wedding. I knew Evan. Dated his brother for a while. When you vanished, everyone had a theory." Grace blinked, unsure how to respond. Leah's expression turned apologetic. "I'm not here to pry. I wanted to say I get it. I left too. Walked away from the city, the noise, the expectations. Found peace in a pottery studio 2 towns over." She paused, then added with a smile, "Seeing you here, it's like getting permission." Grace smiled back. "You never needed it, but I'm glad you found your peace." Leah nodded once, then slipped away into the crowd. Jack came up beside her. "Friend?" "Something like that," Grace said. And in that moment she realized her story had ripples. Quiet ones, maybe, but powerful. That evening, back at the cabin, Ellie stood in the middle of the garden holding a small trowel and a brown envelope. "What's this?" Grace asked, kneeling beside her. Ellie beamed. "Saved some of the seeds from the fall. Daddy taught me. I want to plant them together." She tore open the packet and dropped a few into Grace's palm. Grace stared down at the tiny specks of life. "I don't even know what they are," she whispered. "Doesn't matter," Ellie said. "It'll be something good." Distured together, they pressed the seeds into the earth. Later that night, Jack and Grace sat by the fire, their hands laced, shoulders brushing. He looked over at her. "You ever wonder what your old life would look like now?" Grace considered it. "I think about it less than I used to. I remember pieces now, some birthdays, some names, but they don't pull at me anymore. It's like they've found a shelf where they can rest." Jack nodded. "You ever miss it?" She leaned into him. "I miss parts of the person I was learning to become before I ran, but I think she finally caught up." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm proud of you," he murmured. Grace closed her eyes. "I'm proud of us." As the firelight flickered, Jack pulled a small notebook from the side table. "Got something to show you." He opened it to a rough sketch. Simple lines, charcoal on paper. A cabin expanded. One more room, more light, a wider porch. A swing set out back. Grace stared, blinking. "Is this—" "Our future," Jack said. "If you want it." She touched the page, her voice catching. "Yes, yes, I do." The next morning, Grace stepped out into the garden alone, barefoot in the damp grass. The dew clung to her skin, cool and alive. She walked to the lavender bed, now blooming again. The scent wrapped around her like memory and promise. She knelt and whispered something soft to the plants, something between prayer and gratitude. And as she stood, she realized she didn't just survive losing her memory. She rewrote it, in roots and soil, in laughter and late-night tea, in Ellie's drawings and Jack's quiet strength, in every seed planted and every hand held. She had become a new story, and it was growing. The morning dawned golden and kind. Mist clung gently to the valley floor, and the scent of pine and lilac drifted on the breeze. The cabin, once a quiet refuge for a grieving man and his little girl, now pulsed with quiet excitement. Something was different today, something sacred. Inside, Ellie adjusted the lace hem of her soft lilac dress, biting her lip as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She had never worn anything this twirly, as she called it. Jack knelt beside her, adjusting the ribbon in her hair. "You look just like your mama when she dressed for spring church." Ellie tilted her head. "Do you think she'd be happy today?" He paused, the question settling into his chest. "I think she'd be proud. Of you. Of us. And of how much love found its way back here." He kissed her forehead, then reached for the little basket of wildflowers she was clutching. "You've got petals to throw, kiddo." She grinned. Out in the garden, Grace stood in front of the mirror Jack had built for her. An old farmhouse window frame polished and hung from the pine outside their room. She wore a dress she had sewn with Evelyn during a quiet weekend visit, stitched by hand with care and grace. The sleeves were simple, the neckline modest, but the skirt swirled like a soft whisper with every breath of wind. Her rings sparkled faintly in the morning sun. She took a deep breath, feeling not nerves, but peace. There were no crowds, no cameras, no headlines, just pine trees, a few close neighbors, Ellie's giggle floating across the field, and Jack, somewhere out there, waiting. She didn't remember her first almost wedding, but she would remember this one, every second of it. The ceremony was held under the same old oak where Jack had first built the garden boxes, back when Grace was still more mystery than memory. Chairs were lined in two neat rows, draped with fabric and hung with mason jars filled with lavender and daisies. The breeze carried the scent like a prayer. Ellie walked down the aisle first, barefoot and glowing, scattering petals like she was painting the air with joy. When she reached the front, she took her place beside Jack and whispered loudly, "She's coming, Daddy." Grace stepped out from behind the tall row of sunflowers and paused, soaking it all in. The sight of Jack, standing tall, his flannel shirt tucked into clean slacks, his eyes misty but smiling, nearly undid her. He didn't look like a fairy tale prince. He looked like home, and she was walking toward it. With every step, her past faded just a little more. Not forgotten but folded in, like compost to soil, something once painful now feeding the beauty of what was growing. Their vows were handwritten and honest. Jack went first. "I didn't know if I'd ever fall in love again. Losing Caroline felt like losing the sun, but then you showed up, covered in dirt, scared and stubborn, and you brought light into a place I thought would always be dark. You weren't just a stranger who needed saving. You were the answer I didn't know I was still allowed to hope for." Grace blinked hard to keep her vision clear. "My turn," she whispered, and unfolded the piece of paper she'd rewritten 4 times that week. "I used to wonder who I was, who I used to be. I don't anymore. I know who I am because of the way you and Ellie made space for me when I had nothing. You didn't ask for explanations. You just offered kindness. In your eyes, I learned to see myself again. And in this life, in this garden, with this family, I choose to grow every day. With you." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Even Scout, lounging in the front row with a hand-sewn bow tie, let out a heartfelt whine. Later, as guests laughed and passed around plates of peach cobbler and homemade cider, Grace walked to the edge of the garden and stared out across the land. The hills were dusted with late spring green. Birds dipped in and out of the fields. Somewhere behind her, Ellie was chasing bubbles. Jack was telling a story to neighbors, and someone had turned on soft music from a radio in the truck. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her. She didn't remember everything from her old life. She never would. But she remembered the first time Ellie reached for her hand, the first time Jack left his coffee beside the fire for her to sip, the first time she realized she wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. Those were her truest memories, and she would build more. That night, the cabin glowed with soft light and laughter. Ellie had fallen asleep curled up in the armchair, a blanket half draped over her, and a piece of wedding cake still on her plate. Grace stood barefoot in the kitchen, swaying slightly to the music playing from the radio. Jack came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Married life suits you," he whispered into her hair. She leaned back into him. "It suits us." They stood like that for a while, no words, no plans, just the comfort of shared stillness. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden shadows. Outside, the stars watched quietly from above. Finally, Jack said, "What do you want our first morning as husband and wife to be like?" Grace turned to face him, her smile soft and steady. "I want coffee," she said, "and your pancakes. That can be arranged. And I want to take Ellie down to the creek, pick wildflowers, and press them into a book, so I never forget this day." Jack brushed her cheek with his thumb. "You're not going to forget anything that matters." "No," she said, resting her forehead to his, "because this is the memory we built, and it's ours." In the quiet cabin in the woods where a single dad once lived with sorrow and strength, where a lost woman found not only a name but a purpose, where a child found her voice again, something beautiful had taken root. It would bloom every season, and it would never fade. Now it's your turn. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know which part of the world you're in. Drop a comment below and let me know what touched you most in this story. Your thoughts truly inspire me to keep creating. If you enjoyed The Bride with No Memory and you believe in the power of kindness, healing, and second chances, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching and sharing your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope this story brought a little warmth to your heart.